Okay, guys, so with the What If series coming out here in a few weeks, I thought it'd be kind of fun to sort of do some What If stories here and there. We do have a whole playlist of What If stories, some of which are based on the ones that Marvel's done, and actually some of them are ones that we made up. So make sure you guys check that video series down in the description. But in this one, we're going to cover Avengers Disassembled, right? I.e. Scarlet Witch kills the Marvel Universe. So here's the cool thing about this is that for those of you guys who never covered or never saw our videos on Avengers Disassembled, this was basically a story that Brian Michael Bendis launched and editor-in-chief Joe Quesada came up with to basically get rid of the Avengers as they existed in Marvel Comics and replace them with a new Avengers team called the New Avengers. Ultimately, it was a cool story. It had some cool moments, probably one of the cooler stories that Marvel did. But the What If series, or at least this What If story, is predicated on that concept with a few small changes here and there, and then like one massive change once you get toward the end. So much like the original Avengers Disassembled story, that you had a bunch of Avengers who were meeting at the mansion, and then you had Jack of Hearts, who was previously a dead character that basically had the ability to channel energy and then detonate, basically was resurrected from the dead by the Scarlet Witch, came to Avengers Mansion, and then blew the whole place up. While that was going on, you had the events of Tony Stark, who was in front of the UN, and then had been tricked into appearing drunk by the Scarlet Witch, and then just went on a drunken tirade, literally just lambasting countries for owing him money and all that kind of stuff. That led to Stark Industries stock basically plummeting, and then Tony Stark couldn't fund the team anymore, hence the reason why the Avengers Disassembled. If you guys are curious about the main story itself, I'll have a link to that in the description as well. The main story is really, really cool, so make sure you guys check that out. But the cool thing about this is that you basically have this kind of cleanup duty that's going on, right? Where you've got Carol Danvers as she existed back then. She was called Miss Marvel. And then, of course, you have Hank McCoy, Beast, basically of the X-Men / Avengers, who's just kind of going through and analyzing the whole situation. They end up finding little bits and pieces of Ultron. Now, much like the original Avengers Disassembled story, that Vision had basically been used by the Scarlet Witch and then sent to Avengers Mansion and basically spawned a whole litany of Ultron robots and then like died, right? It was a weird thing. It was really grotesque when it happened in the story. It was wild. And then at the same time that's going on, much like the original Avengers Disassembled story, She-Hulk goes on a rampage. Now, there are a couple differences here. She-Hulk went on a rampage in like a local part of New York. I don't recall her going on a rampage and tearing up all the different superheroes, but again, it's been like a few years since I read it, so I could be wrong. But ultimately, this led to like a coming together of everybody who had ever been an Avenger, all called together by Captain America, right? And so again, things play out very similar to the way they had before, but this kind of explanation that we're given here is actually given to us insofar as like cleaning everything up in the aftermath of everything that had happened. Now, those of you guys who had read the old Avengers Disassembled story, one of the things that had also happened is Scarlet Witch had spawned a Kree armada above Earth, and then like all these Kree soldiers started coming down and attacking everything and all that kind of stuff, and Hawkeye sacrifices life in the process. One of the funny things about this is that when that originally happened, you didn't know the Scarlet Witch was the one behind it. You thought it was just everything going bad, right? Everything just going south. Later on, you learned it was the Scarlet Witch, and that was the craziness of it. But like in the moment, you didn't really know that was happening, and it was nuts when it took place. It was really, really cool. But what basically ended up happening here is a couple different things. The first is that as they're investigating and as they're having these conversations and they're basically talking, that this led to this kind of realization and this revelation to everybody that Steve Rogers and Scarlet Witch were having an affair. That they were basically sleeping together. That yes, Scarlet Witch was technically married to the Vision, but as far as Sam Wilson was concerned, he's like, it always kind of made sense, right? I mean, like she's basically with an android cannot give her actual kids. But for whatever reason, she found herself growing closer to Steve Rogers and then realized Steve Rogers could give her kids. One thing led to another, and they were touching naughty bits. And so again, it all kind of jumps back because when this whole thing goes down, it basically looks as though the Scarlet Witch has completely lost her mind because the relationship between her and Steve didn't matter because she basically confronted Steve with like a kind of manifestation of the Red Skull. And of course, a whole bunch of soldiers start attacking Steve Rogers and all that kind of stuff. And then ultimately Magneto seemingly comes out of nowhere and basically whisks the Scarlet Witch away after Doctor Strange had appeared and basically put her in a coma and essentially knocked her out, right? And so that, of course, was what was part of the original Avengers Disassembled story that led into House of M, where Scarlet Witch was basically taken to Genosha, and then the whole events of House of M happened after that. And so the big question they have here is to kind of track down things, first of all, to understand how the Scarlet Witch could do this. And so ultimately, it leads to Carol Danvers and Beast continuing their investigation and then tracking down Quicksilver, right, the brother of Scarlet Witch, and asking the question, how do your sister's powers work? We need to understand her powers so we can understand how all this transpired. And ultimately, the response of Quicksilver, and one of the things that was always murky about her character is he's like, nobody really knows how her powers work, right? She can just, alter probabilities, right? Her hex probability power, whatever it is, effect probability, which is just a really nice way of saying she can alter reality. And that's true. That was one of the big moments behind Brian Michael Bendis' Bendis's original Avengers Disassembled story going into the events of House of M is that Scarlet Witch's powers had never really been fully fleshed out. You had these things where, like, in the early days, she had the ability to alter probability with her hex powers, and then eventually she meets up with Agatha Harkness, and Agatha Harkness trains her, and it's like, she's a Nexus being. She's a focal point of all magic in the universe. Okay, cool. What does that mean? We don't know. It just means she can do stuff, and then, like, you go eventually into into Brian Michael Bendis's Avengers Disassembled, and it's she can control chaos magic. And that's one of the crazy things, because you did see stories up until that point, right? The idea of Chthon taking her over and different things along those lines, but Marvel never fully fleshed it out. It was just kind of scattered and all over the place. But because of the fact that she can manipulate essentially chaos magic, or at least the explanation that's given to Beast and Carol Danvers by Quicksilver is her powers somewhere, exist somewhere between mutant powers and magic, and it's a weird thing, I don't fully understand it. It leads them to Doctor Strange. Then when they get to Doctor Strange, they fight something there. It doesn't really matter, right? It's kind of a pointless thing. But ultimately, Doctor Strange kind of reveals this idea that supposedly there's not supposed to be any such thing as chaos magic. But at the end of the day, the response of Beast is, of course there's chaos magic, right? It's just nobody uses it because it is chaotic. You don't know how it's going to manifest or how it's going to function. Now, in more recent years, and this is something to understand, chaos magic is something that had existed in Marvel Comics for a long time, but like the Scarlet Witch, it was never fully fleshed out. It wasn't until the aftermath of Avengers Disassembled, House of M, and especially going into things like Children's Crusade and the stories afterwards, that basically chaos magic is the power of Chthon. It's this wildly incredible form of magic that's so incredibly dangerous, but if a person can master it and use it, they become a multiversal force of energy. And that's why the Scarlet Witch, in possession of the life force, the life entity, and using chaos magic, was able to strip away 98% of the mutant population's powers, not just in the main Marvel universe, but across the multiverse. Remember, that's one of the things that we talked about, that there was a story that came after the events of House of M and Decimation, where Beast realized it was a multiversal act, where 98% of the mutant population's powers were taken away across the multiverse. And then, like, much later on, when you get to Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run, you see a future version of the Old Man Logan universe, and mutants are back, because essentially everything in Old Man Logan took place seemingly around the time of Avengers Disassembled and Decimation, House of M, that kind of stuff. That future storyline that you saw in Fantastic Four by Jonathan Hickman takes place after the events of Hope Summers and the 12 Lights, when mutants start popping back up again, or really Avengers versus X-Men. It's one of the things, Marvel never definitively says that. It's just one of those things you kind of figure out as you're reading comics. But also, Doctor Strange kind of looks at this and says, okay, so I know you guys saw me appear, basically defeating the Scarlet Witch, putting her in a coma, and I know you saw Magneto appear, but here's something you also need to look at. Look at the Scarlet Witch's hands. And he's like, that's the magic hand positioning. She created that illusion, right? She created an illusion that I showed up, put her in a coma. He's like, then she created the illusion that Magneto took her away. And because of everything that had happened, you guys were just happy to see her gone, right? So you weren't going to ask any questions. But the reality is, that's all a magical illusion that was created by the Scarlet Witch. Where she's at right now is probably in Genosha. And we can't just run up on her, right? Because of all the power that she possesses and using what I guess really is just chaos magic, that if we were to go running up on her right now, we would all surely die. And so what we need is some form of a plan. We need something that can basically help us go in and take that place out, take her out in that location. And so you end up having Beast, who actually calls together a combination of X-Men and Avengers at the Xavier Institute for Higher Learning. And he calls them all here because, and also has the Watcher here. He calls them all here because he's like, we need a plan. Right? Like, we need to know what it is that we're going to do. And I have a plan, but I need a guy on our side that can basically help us figure out what's happening. And ultimately, Sam Wilson ends up showing up. And Sam Wilson confirms exactly what they all thought, that at the end of the day, it wasn't Scarlet Witch acting alone. Scarlet Witch did all this at the behest of what was basically Steve Rogers, that the two of them are working together. The problem is, Steve Rogers is a master of battle strategy, and that Cyclops is the closest thing they have. The problem is that Cyclops is no Steve Rogers. And so at the end of the day, they have what is in effect a poor man's Captain America in terms of battle strategy, hoping to go in and win this battle, which you guys can already tell is probably not going to end well. Now, at that point, you switch over to Genosha, and you basically end up finding out that, yeah, Steve Rogers has been working with Scarlet Witch, and that the whole thing behind this is that he was the only one who really understood her, right? That Vision, being a computer, being a synthezoid, whatever you want to call him, was removed from humanity, and as a result, could never truly understand, Wanda and the power she had, and how really dangerous she could be, but how they could also be used for good. And that Steve Rogers is the one that figured that out. And so ultimately you kind of switch back over to the X-Men / Avengers team, and you basically end up having split into two parts. The first one is going to be a front-facing team that's going to walk towards the castle of Genosha head on, right? The base of operations where Wanda and Magneto and all of them are at. They're just going to go head on. The second team is going to be accompanied by Doctor Strange, and is going to basically keep them cloaked, right? That not even Wanda is going to be able to pick up on them. Now, the problem with this is that the fear is like, Wanda's going to eventually realize that we're here, right? Because the power she's channeling is power beyond my own. So we have to be fast. And so ultimately you have this team that kind of, really sneaks in to where, or at least, seemingly sneaks into where Wanda and them are at. And Captain America picked up on the fact that they were there because he knew it was the only thing that they would do, the only way they could actually get in. As soon as he saw that there was a contingent team walking towards the entrance, he's like, okay, I was born at night, but I wasn't born last night. There's going to be another team that's going to be coming in here, and they're probably going to be coming in here through that window right there. And then he immediately attacks Iron Man, right? Immediately subdues Iron Man. And then from there, he's like, Wanda, remove his armor. And then he's like, Wanda, like, take the rest of the team, right? Like, subdue everybody else, contain them. And that's exactly what happens. The two of them working together, it really is incredible. It really is a sight to behold. Somebody with the mastery of battle strategy like Captain America working alongside a person with the power of the Scarlet Witch is nuts. And that's when you end up finding out the idea of an illusion created by the Scarlet Witch to basically trick the Avengers into thinking that Doctor Strange had put her into a coma and Magneto had taken her away. That was the plan of Captain America. Everything that's happened here is the plan of Steve Rogers. And the reason why they're doing this is because in the mind of Steve Rogers, using the power of Wanda, they can wipe all of reality clean and then fix it, right? They can basically set it back to a place where it's a place of peace and harmony and all that kind of stuff, instead of just a series of warring factions. And the reality is the other way to pull this off is they have Charles Xavier. Now, in reality, the only reason Charles Xavier is here is because of the fact that in the original Avengers Disassembled and really the beginning of House of M, if we're being honest with ourselves, Wanda took Charles Xavier and then used his power of telepathy to scan the minds of everybody on Earth and their subconscious desires. And then that's why the House of M turned out the way that it was, why reality was created in that way, because subconsciously, that's what everybody wanted, right? That's it was basically the perfect reality where everybody got what they wanted, or at least close to it. But ultimately, when they brought Charles Xavier in here, that Charles Xavier kind of agreed and was like, yeah, I mean, I know the ends aren't necessarily supposed to justify the means, but I mean, this is not a bad plan, right? It's not the worst idea ever. Of course, they'd also poisoned him. And the indication here is that Wanda's actually manipulating Charles Xavier into saying this, right? But regardless of the situation, that it doesn't matter as far as Wanda and them are concerned, right? It's not really relevant here. That the important thing is that ultimately, they're right, and they're going to be able to overcome pretty much all of the Avengers, right? The biggest problem with this is that in the middle of this whole conflict, Rogue reaches out and touches Wanda. The problem is she touches Wanda while the spell is being cast. And so it's basically an incomplete chaos magic spell, which this is when basically things start to go awry. And Captain America literally screams at him. He's like, no, like, do not stop her while she's casting this spell. But ultimately, when she does that, everybody dies, right? Because it's an incomplete spell, right? Everybody here is basically killed. Like, Doctor Strange shows up and he was like, what happened? Like, they're all gone. And it's like, they've all basically been wiped out. Now, the way this kind of wraps up is a little weird here in the sense that, like, Sam Wilson basically grabs Captain America and says, look, man, like, I get Wanda's kind of down for the count, right? And here's the thing you have to understand, though. Like, Steve Rogers, you're a broken man. Like, you never would have thought about something like this in a normal circumstance. Like, you never would have come up with this idea that wiping away all of creation and recreating it is the best thing. Like, I don't know what it was, man, you being frozen in the ice or something like that, but like, your mind's damaged. Your mind is screwed up. And so when Scarlet Witch wakes back up, Steve Rogers tries to talk her down, and then he can't, right? And so ultimately, he ends up basically using her to focus on the love that the two of them share, and in doing so, wipe themselves out of existence, right? And that's basically it. Everybody else is actually resurrected. So I guess Scarlet Witch kills the Marvel Universe, and then they all come back, and then Scarlet Witch kills herself. But nonetheless, they wipe themselves out of existence, right? Like, they're basically no longer there, and they just kind of leave the universe or leave the rest of the world to unfold the way it was supposed to. Having said that, this story was ass, but I thought it'd be kind of funny, fun to cover this thing. I thought it'd be kind of interesting to cover, the what if Scarlet Witch killed the Marvel Universe? It's a terrible story. It's garbage. It's probably one of the worst what if stories ever written in the history of Marvel Comics. I'm sorry, Jeff Parker. A lot of the stuff you write is great. This was not. But yeah, no, it's one of those weird things. Regardless, thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Maybe you didn't. I don't know. And I will catch you all later. Peace.